want to thank everyone today who's joined this wonderful event and thank Mrs. Hostler for lending her generous support to make today's lecture series a reality. I want to welcome all of you to the Charles W. Hostler Institute on World Affairs and the President's Lecture Series. Also, I want to welcome and thank our vice presidents, deans, and campus leaders for being part of creating a dialogue for intellectual conversations on campus. These conversations are crucially important as we develop the future global citizens, compassionate leaders, and ethical innovators who will solve the world's greatest challenges. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I want to share a brief history and significance of the Charles W. Hostler Institute on World Affairs. The Charles W. Hostler Institute on World Affairs plays a critical role in the educational mission of San Diego State University. It was founded in 1942 as the Institute on World Affairs to inform students, faculty, and the wider public on global affairs. Guided by their operating motto, "Let the other side be heard," the Institute has provided SDSU and the greater San Diego community with high-level and spirited intellectual engagement on a rich diversity of international issues and controversies. The Institute has hosted distinguished speakers from around the world that have included ambassadors, Nobel laureates, and world leaders. The center now bears the name of Charles W. Hostler, former U.S. ambassador to Bahrain. Ambassador Charles Hostler endowed the Institute in 2004. Now, Mrs. Chenye Hostler is working diligently to carry on his legacy of distinction and generosity. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, four-star Admiral Eric Olson. Admiral Eric Olson served the United States Navy for more than 38 years. He received numerous military decorations, including the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Silver Star for gallantry in combat, and the Bronze Star for valor. He was awarded a special appointment as officer in the French Legion of Honor. Now retired from military service, Admiral Olson continues to lend his knowledge and expertise to private and public agencies, having managed over 60,000 people and over a $10 billion budget. He also continues to invest in the next generation of global leaders as an adjunct professor and senior research scholar in the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia University. Today, we are honored to gather and learn from him about an intriguing topic, the world at night. Please help me in giving a warm welcome to Admiral Olson.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction, but thank you much more so for inviting me to be with you today. I look forward to this since I first had the opportunity to think about it. And it's much more than a presentation for me. It's a reunion of sorts. I've got many old colleagues, some of my personal heroes and mentors are in the room today. I'm reminded that nothing ruins a good story like an eyewitness. So I'm going to have to stay as close to the truth as possible today. I certainly thank Ambassador Charles W. Hostler for his gift to this university and to Chenye for continuing so vigorously to carry on the legacy of this important institute. And thank you for being the catalyst for Dr. De La Torre's invitation today. So this is, and there will be I'll talk for a while, and then there will be a question and answer period after that, but you don't have to wait for the Q&A period to interrupt me. If you want to make a point or ask a question or recalibrate me or ask for me to clarify something, this is going to be kind of a wide-ranging thing today. So please, let's take it where you want it to go, if you're willing to do that. So I do call this the world at night. You'll see why later. That Admiral Eric Olson should say retired. I left military service about 7.5 years ago. And in the introduction, you heard some of the things I've been doing since. I'm going to talk about the world in which we live or might expect to live for what you might call the foreseeable future, although I do subscribe to what Yogi Berra is said to have said, which is it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. And I'm not going to go into the distant sort of space age, or actually this is inside the horizon of the space age at this point on this slide. And I'm not going to go back too far. I'm not going to go back to what, for many of us in this room, was, during our formative years, expecting to be on the receiving end of a ballistic missile attack. And I'm one of those kids who in elementary school used to rehearse on a frequent basis getting under my desk when the air raid siren would go off, pointing my rear end towards the glass in the window because that was the least vulnerable part of my body. But I believed that in my little elementary school in Tacoma, Washington, that I was somehow going to be the target of a Soviet ballistic missile attack. And we're past that, although nuclear weaponry has certainly resurfaced in the global discussion over the last few years. That era sort of ended with the tearing down, the symbolic tearing down of the Berlin Wall and reunification of Germany, and many of us in this room remember that. I'll focus more on kind of this time forward. And I'm certain pretty much all of us remember where we were, where we learned about the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and near simultaneous attack on the nerve center of our United States military at the Pentagon. And brought to us by this man, and I'll talk about him more later if you want me to. I'm going to generally talk about a world that's in a reconstructive phase, the end of the bipolar Soviet-American superpower era, where many of the countries, most of the countries of the world, lined up under one or the other for political or economic or geographic reasons, is no longer the world in which we live, with other emerging superpowers, China foremost among them, and a globalization that has meant this bipolarization is no longer the way that the world works. It's a world in which more than 200 Nigerian schoolgirls can be kidnapped, and now, several years later, 119 of them, I believe, are still missing. And most of the ones who are no longer missing either escaped, some were released, but many were sold into slavery, sold as wives at the age of 11 to 14 years old for about $10 a piece. And along with those 119 from that original group that was missing, several hundred others in smaller batches have been kidnapped and taken into hiding. Brought to us by this group, Boko Haram, which is a terrorist criminal organization masquerading as a military force. They want to think of themselves, they want us to think of them as a military force, and you can see how they dress and present themselves in their formal presentation of Boko Haram accordingly. This is a group that actually wanted us to think of them as a terrorist force when they were much more a military capability. This is the early days of the Islamic State, ISIL, ISIS, Daesh in the Arabic acronym, which began under the leadership of former Ba'athist generals in Iraq who had been broken out of jail, who formed a Sunni-based terrorist group, seized military equipment, seized villages, seized banks, seized oil fields and refineries, so that they funded themselves almost like a nation, had a military almost like a nation, and seized and held territory at great expanses of territory and controlled the people in as a very, very strict form of government. Fortunately, that capability has been eroded a lot, but they remain very brutal, brutality that we hadn't seen on this planet for several decades. And although we have successfully, the United States military over the last few years, with the support of other militaries of the world, very, very importantly, the Iraqi military, has beaten ISIS back, but hasn't yet shouted them down. So to believe that ISIS is gone even without territory is probably not accurate. These are like a bunch of guys standing on a corner with their hands in their pocket, as they are, but the next day they were the little green men. The Russian soldiers never identified or admitted by Russia to be Russian soldiers, but they seized Crimea almost without a shot and almost without an injury. In my world of special operations, this was a classic special operation. I mean, it was a low-profile invasion of a country and then seizure of that country with very, very little resistance. We believe that they had gone to school on us, and we certainly are going to school on them. Here, a nation with a brutal dictator, Bashar al-Assad, fighting war within his own nation against his own people in order to regain, in order to maintain control over his population. And as you know, the refugee migrant population is largely emanated from the brutality, the violence in Syria. This is Libya, a country without a government and hasn't had one for a long time. At last count, in the pretend government, there were something like 36 different parties represented, with no ability to actually make a decision and run a country. And here in the South China Sea, where China has poured enough sand and concrete on sunken reefs to build what was first declared to be sort of humanitarian atolls that could render safety assistance to people at sea, and now clearly with military capability, and claiming the 12-mile territorial limit around it and the 200-mile economic zone, and a source of some real friction in the South China Sea. And confusion everywhere. A murder in a Saudi consulate in a Turkish embassy attributed to a crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and related to that, not directly, but the leader of Turkey influencing our president in part to pull troops out of Syria, all of it somehow related to Iran, and this confusing globalization of not knowing precisely who friends and enemies are, and trying to come up with policies to deal appropriately in this complex environment is a thing that we simply haven't had to do for many, many years. So Iran is an enigma. We don't know how they think. We don't know how they work. We do know that they have ambitions to dominate regionally. They are threatening globally in certain ways, and they certainly have a nuclear ambition, which may be on ice a bit now in terms of their development programs, but the ambition may not have gone away. And the nuclear saber rattling with North Korea is very much in the news here over the last few weeks as another very enigmatic country. Don't know exactly how it works internally. Poor economy, probably playing the best, they're holding a poor hand of cards and playing it probably as well as they can in order to gain importance on the world stage. Migrants and refugees, a massive crisis in Europe. If you sort of scale up the number of refugees and migrants that have gone into mostly Eastern Europe, if you scaled that up per capita to be a migrant and refugee movement into the United States, it would be about 2 million migrants and refugees that we would have had to absorb over the last several years. We're struggling as a nation to figure out how to absorb 10,000. Closer to home, Boston Marathon bombing, inspired by terrorist politics conducted locally. Back to France, with a bomb attack that killed, I think, 31 people in this bomb that went off in Paris back to the United States, San Bernardino, again inspired by terrorists outside the United States, but conducted inside the United States, back to Brussels, another bomb in an airport that killed, I believe, 38 people and injured more than 100. All of these in the last 5 years. A white van driving across the London Bridge that swerved off and mowed down pedestrians on the sidewalk, seriously injuring over 50. And then in the chaos that came after that, 3 people got out of the van and started stabbing the onlookers with knives. And we all remember in Manchester, England, the attack at the Ariana Grande concert, which was really taking off the gloves in a very brutal way. They didn't need entrance to the arena. It was in a foyer outside the security zone. Around 30 victims, as I recall, many of whom were adolescent girls who went to see their hero sing to them. And a kind of terror that it happens often enough that there are certain elements that are numb to it, and then retaliatory. This is an attack on a mosque in London, not long after the London Bridge attack. Londoners reaching out in revenge to whoever they thought might be associated with those who had conducted that attack. So by the way, there is not an attack in Chicago. That's not breaking news. That's fake news in the upper right. But it's not to say it can't happen. There are those who have continued to declare their intent to conduct another 9/11 type of attack inside the United States. Cyber attack in the lower right is real. We are under some element of cyber attack every day, and in fact, there are some analysts that say between $9 and $10 billion a day in intellectual property is being stolen by those who are penetrating our systems, roaming around through our systems, and taking what they want. And then the lower left, those circles represent terrorist attacks inside the United States. And although all of these aren't news and all of them aren't what you would consider to be terrorist attacks, they are those attacks that result in injury or death that are politically motivated or motivated by an ideology, not by sort of a personal kind of vendetta or a criminal operation. So I'll put this a little bit in context, and one of the things I hate talking about most is me, but I'm just gonna sort of tell you where I'm coming from as I go through the rest of it. And to do that, I'll take you back to the summer of love. I was coming out of my junior year, or going into my junior year in high school during the summer of love, and trying to decide what I was going to do for a living. And I wasn't a love child. It was a summer of love, but it was also a summer of severe racial strife in the United States. The Detroit riots were within a year of sort of the summer of love, and it was a time of the peak of the protest against the Vietnam War. This was in October of 1967. I actually went to this rally, not because I identified with all the protesters there, but because I lived in the area and I was curious about what was going on. And I walked away from it, maybe this is me reinventing my thinking at the time a little bit, but I walked away from it thinking these aren't necessarily my people who are protesting against what the nation has decided we should do, but I'm really proud as an American that they can do this within sight of the nation's capital and the White House. And that was a freedom that we have in this country that very few other nations have. And my mother, probably with malice aforethought, took me to the Naval Academy for a visit 3 weeks later. And when I said, how much does it cost? They said, nothing, we pay you. I applied to 2 colleges, and the other one didn't accept me. So I found myself as a midshipman at the Naval Academy, and realizing soon enough that I wasn't about this. I wasn't about big, fast, loud. And I wasn't about, my mistaken impression of the Marine Corps was a regimented march in line kind of an organization. I was much more about this, about Vietnam was still going, riverine boats in Vietnam, Seabees in Vietnam, small groups working together closely, making a difference in the micro-region where they were, and a chance, I thought, to gain responsibility at a lower level. The frogmen in the upper left were still a thing, the underwater demolition teams that had come out of World War II in Korea, and the SEALs on the lower right, who were a relatively new thing at the time, formed in 1962, and I'm talking 1967. So they were still a new thing, and there wasn't much known about them in the public domain, but there was enough out there to intrigue me. So when I had the chance to volunteer for SEAL training at the Naval Academy, I was fortunate enough to be one of 3 members of my class selected to do that. I ended up out at SEAL training, which takes place over in Coronado, California, something that I think the city and community of San Diego can be very proud of, is that this is the center of a very important element of the Navy and the broader military. At SEAL training, you learn a lot about being a teammate, about carrying your share of the load and depending on others to carry their share of the load. But you also learn a lot about yourself, about when you have to, and that's me in that photograph, when you have to dig deep to draw that extra strength, mostly mental strength, not physical strength, to do something that you didn't know you could do, feared that you probably couldn't do. And your mission is to prove yourself wrong and prove those who think you can't do it wrong as well. I'll tell you that I think the guy behind me in that photograph was my class leader at SEAL training. I ended up being in the smallest class ever to graduate from SEAL training. There were 4 of us on graduation day, 54 of us on day 1, 4 of us on graduation day. But my class leader, there was Ensign Doug Hatfield, who's here in the audience today. Doug, where are you? Yeah, so Doug Hatfield's right here. And we all, at some point, depend heavily on those around us to get us through a difficult moment. And Doug was one of those guys who got me through many of those. But eventually you reach this where, it's up to you. There's nobody to help. You're going to do it or not. And it's often easier to quit. And I'm going to digress just a little bit to tell you a little vignette about SEAL training, because it is a formative experience for those who go through it. But later on, when I was sort of responsible for the bigger Special Operations Force, the commander of the SEAL organization, a guy named Joe McGuire, conducted a study to determine that we were concerned about the attrition rate. I told you 4 out of 54 in my class originally graduated, but the attrition rate over time has been about 75%. Year after year after year, summer to winter, about 75% of the people who walk in the front door, all of whom think they're going to graduate, all of whom have passed through some number of filters in order to get to the front door of SEAL training. On graduation day, only 25% of them are still there. By the way, a bunch of them are in this room. I said some of my mentors and personal heroes are here. If you went through SEAL training, would you raise your hand? Yeah, so look at that, about a dozen in here. In this room. So Joe did a study. Joe did a study about trying to figure out if he could reduce the attrition rate by finding out more detail about the people who were leaving, because we knew 3/4 weren't making it. We knew most of those didn't make it because they quit. They left voluntarily when they hit a mental obstacle that they couldn't get themselves past. Statistics prove that. About 75% of those who didn't graduate quit. The other were physical, academic, medical drops. What we were surprised to learn is that about 3/4 of the ones who quit at breakfast or at lunch. They didn't. It had nothing to do with the quality of the food. It was fear of failure. They would look on the schedule and see what was coming next. After lunch is a 6-mile swim or a 14-mile run, or I have to do the obstacle course backwards, or something that scared them enough that they didn't start it. And for me, that was a real epiphany, that most people eliminated themselves from something that had been a dream, in many cases a dream for many, many years, because of fear of failure. And the armchair psychologist in me says it's much easier to explain that you opted out of a program to your mom, to your dad, brother, sister, wife, girlfriend, It's a lot easier to explain that you opted out of a program than that you failed in a program, and people remove themselves from a position of having to do that. The other side of that is they did a study on the 25% who succeeded, and found that several categories, but in the category of sports and pastimes, the most reliable predictors of success were having been a competitive water polo player or competitive wrestler at the high school or collegiate level. Probably no real surprise there. What we were surprised to learn was that if you were also a chess player, your chances of success tripled. And so I know I was lucky because I was both a water polo player and a wrestler, and I didn't play chess. But you can correlate those. I think chess players don't quit at breakfast or at lunch. They're not worried about what's coming next. They're thinking next week and next month. They're thinking about what happens when they graduate. How are they going to do as a SEAL in the teams some months down the road? And so we realized that without realizing it, that we were really creating a community of more strategic thinkers by self-selection. Enough on that. Eventually earned the Trident, did my operational time. SEAL is an acronym for Sea, Air, Land. There's the Sea, Air, Land part. Operating at night. Night was our friend. Operating underwater. Doug Hatfield and I were in the same platoon after we graduated, operating mini submarines off big mother submarines. This is a very clandestine capability where a submarine with a SEAL delivery vehicle in a garage on the back of it, you see all that there, can submerge off the coast of San Diego, conduct an underwater operation anywhere in the world, and not surface again until it gets back off the coast of San Diego. So a very clandestine capability, and because there was a free flooding, as you can see by the open doors on the mini submarine, we were exposed to the ambient environment. So for me, the Cold War was appropriately named. I did get a chance to get outside my skin a little bit as a United Nations peacekeeper. Met my wife, Marilyn, while I was a peacekeeper. She was the United Nations employee in the Middle East. Marilyn is here with us today, and we've been married 37 years or something like that. But as a United Nations peacekeeper, Americans were in a minority. We were in a much broader international crowd. I was teaching desert driving, among other things, in the Sinai Desert. And it caused me to look back at the United States from a perspective of 18 other nations who were represented in that United Nations mission. I said I was up in the upper left-hand corner of this map as a kid, and my map was this, is just like it was many of yours. I knew there were 49 other states because I had to learn their capitals, but I hadn't traveled much through them and hadn't traveled much off of this map. And then I got to the United Nations, and I'm sorry, oops, pushing the wrong button here. Yeah, and then this became my map, as it became many of your maps. I know not all of you, but my precious country, the United States of America, smack dab in the middle of this map. Our sworn enemies at the time, the Soviet Union, split between the upper right and the upper left as if they weren't a whole country. But it's a world of distance and terrain and geography and political boundaries and all the rest of it, and that was my map of the world. And then I got to the Middle East to work for the United Nations. My boss was a Russian, a Soviet at the time, lieutenant colonel in Cairo. And the first time I walked into my boss's office to introduce myself to what was a sworn enemy of the United States, but my boss, a Soviet lieutenant colonel, the map on the wall behind his desk looked like this. And I thought, the Soviet Union in the middle and my precious country split between the upper right and the upper left like it's not even a real thing. And it was an important lesson in perspective that you see things from where you are, and frankly, the more perspectives you can take on something, the better it is. And of course, we had a bunch of Australians in the mission, so they looked the whole thing upside down. So fast forward several years, I will say that, sort of back to that 911 slide, I was the commander of Naval Special Warfare, the head SEAL, if you will, that also included mini submarines and boats, and a lot of support on 911. I'd been in command about 2 years before 911, and then another year afterwards, and I'll talk about the response to that if anybody wants me to. But that was obviously a formative experience, but eventually became the commander of the United States Special Operations Command down in Tampa, Florida. This is a Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps Joint Command, special operations assigned from all of the services, either permanently or for an extended period of time to that Special Operations Command. It was born out of failure. Many of you remember our failed attempt to rescue the 52 hostages who were held in Tehran in the American Embassy in 1980, and the crash that occurred at a site known then and now as Desert One, a remote portion of the Iranian desert, which caused that mission to be canceled, and those hostages stayed in captivity for about 9 more months. The failure of that and the investigation into that failure led us, the nation, to realize that we had never invested in a capability to conduct that kind of a mission. The services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, didn't know how to work together in a very complex environment. Our emergency procedures, our radio frequencies, our equipment, none of that was compatible. For this mission, they never did a full mission profile, we would call it now, start to finish, with approximate distances and terrain and all of that for rehearsal. Many of the leaders didn't meet each other until the days or weeks prior to the mission, and it failed. So by law, imposed on a reluctant, those are both polite words reflecting back on the time, imposed by Congress on a reluctant Department of Defense, the Special Operations Command was created in 1980, 6 years after the disaster at Desert One, 6 years. And then I was fortunate to be the commander of the Special Operations Command as my last assignment. I had four years there from 2007 to 2011. While in that position, of course, that was, first part of that at least, was the height of our activities in Afghanistan and Iraq, but there's a much bigger world than Iraq and Afghanistan, for which Special Operations Forces were an appropriate element of United States representation or United States power. So I found myself I had a short chain of command. I worked for the Secretary of Defense and he worked for the President. So I found myself in a position to talk, certainly more so to the Secretary of Defense, but occasionally to the President, about the deployment of Special Operations Forces and the employment of those forces once they were where we had deployed them. What is it, the Special Operations community, where should they be and what should they be doing when they get there? And in trying to figure out how to talk about that, I came across this graphic, which many of you have seen before, but this is the world at night. Composite photograph of Earth taken from space, and everybody takes something different away from this, but what I wanted to use it for was as a representation of how our strategic thinking needed to change. In some ways was caused to change, but needed to change more. Our strategic thinking through the Cold War up to 9/11 at least, and I think too much beyond that, was that the strategically important places on Earth are where the lights are on at night. That's where people live, that's where goods are produced, that's where money's made. Our friends lived in that band, mostly talking from a military perspective, think NATO and some Asian allies. Our adversaries lived in that band, think Soviet Union and emerging communist China. We were very well prepared as a military to operate within that band, either with or against the people who live in that band. We taught ourselves French and German and Russian. We sold military equipment. We operated against the Soviet equipment that was purchased by or provided to other countries. But then on 9/11, we were forced to shift our gaze south. It was no longer about the mid-regions of the northern hemisphere where the lights are on bright at night. The attacks on that day, and most of the attacks against the United States that you're aware of, originated where the lights aren't on at night, where borders are less secure, where airports are less secure, where societal conditions often contribute to the recruitment of people for anti-societal kind of behavior with terrorism. One of those where black markets can thrive, where criminality real serious criminality can take root. And we were, as a military, we were totally unprepared to deal with and against the people who live where the lights aren't on so bright at night. We were very good at French and Spanish. We didn't speak Urdu or Dari or even much Arabic. That's the world where rising populations are a real thing, a factor that affects how people and nations behave independently and with each other. Urbanization, either forced or unforced, people moving out of the deserts, out of the jungles into the cities, because that's where some opportunities lie, but it has a discombobulating psychological effect. Literalization, moving towards the coastlines, and the rise of megacities. 20 years ago, there were 3 megacities in the world. Now there's about 19, I think, and in 20 years from now, there will be 40 or more, with a megacity being defined as 20 million or more people in a dense urban area. Competition for resources, fuel, fossil fuels first and foremost among them, but energy in all of its forms becoming very, very important to how the world works. Competition for resources beyond fossil fuels. In many cases, the precious metals, often called the conflict minerals, because they occur in places so precise, so geographically precise, that they become the dominant element in that place and the source of corruption and criminal behavior in those places. And by the way, the tech world is a draw on these precise metals that are uniquely capable to contribute to some of our technical capabilities. Competition for water, no matter what you think the cause of climate change might be, the truth is the Earth is getting warmer, ice caps are receding, there's dry land where there used to be water, and there's 97% of the water on Earth is salt water. 2% currently is frozen in the ice caps, and we're all competing for that other 1%, most of which is polluted at or near its source. And by the way, along with climate change comes an increase in natural disasters over the last few years. I apologize for the graphic nature of this slide, but persecution is a real thing. It creates behavior that is extreme, and we can remember, I'll get off the slide, but we can remember back to the Jasmine Revolution that became the Arab Spring, began with the self-immolation of a fruit vendor in southwestern Tunisia that led to the overthrow of that country in 3 days and the overthrow of Egypt in 3 weeks. So this is rising disparity of wealth. This photograph happens to be taken in Sao Paulo, but it could be taken in almost any major city in the world as the rich get richer and the population of poor continues to grow. Corruption and patronage as accepted forms of manipulating people in certain parts of the world. Here, mostly about the drug trade, as the United States and Europe continue to get their their cocaine out of South America, mostly Colombia, and their heroin out of South Asia, mostly Afghanistan. And this is human trafficking, with the red and orange countries being countries of origin of humans, and the blue and light blue countries being destinations for those same humans who are being smuggled around the world. Pandemic disease, this is meant to did I miss one? Yeah, no, this is meant to represent Zika and this Ebola, real things that affected, again, how people and nations behave independently and with each other. Regional impact on the stability of our planet. I put up Dolly the sheep. Who remembers cloning of Dolly? I should have looked it up before I came in, but I think Dolly was cloned about 23 or 24 years ago, if I recall. And I put Dolly up here as a reminder, at least it's my belief, and I think technology supports, or the studies support this, that the rules for using a new technology tend to lag the introduction of that technology. The rules for a science tend to lag the introduction of the science by about a generation. And here, 23 years after cloning Dolly, we still have not had the adult level discussion about the moral, legal, ethical consequences of cloning. And when you fast forward that to the biogenetic engineering, some of which is in very advanced stages in countries outside the United States, but certainly some advanced science here as well, where they're selecting not only the gender of their child, but the IQs and physical attributes of their children. They're pre-selecting these, they're building them in to the next generation. You know, if we wait 23 years to have that discussion, then shame on us. Rising of the Chinese middle class, I don't present this as a threat. This is a factor. It's in the United States' best interest to have an economically viable and stable China. But this rise of the middle class in China, some hundreds of millions of Chinese entering a middle class economic system in the next couple of decades is an increase in purchasing power and an economic dynamic on Earth that we haven't seen. Still a European crisis, and Brexit is connected to that. The upper right is meant to be the youth unemployment crisis in Spain. We here in our 17 to 24-year-old population have an unemployment rate of those seeking work of about 17 to 18%, and we think that's too high. In Spain, it's been 50% for a decade, a generation, part of a generation disenfranchised by its inability to find jobs, and of course, the continuing crisis of starvation across much of Africa. These may be lab technicians searching for a cure for a cancer, or they may be searching for that next strain of a biological weapon of mass destruction, as there are those who have stated their intent to acquire and use such a weapon against us and our allies. And these may be students diligently studying their homework on a military topic, or they may be one room in a warehouse full of hackers, incentivized hackers, who are trying every day and being rewarded for every success to penetrate the computer on your desk and my desk, the computers at Wall Street and the Pentagon and Hoover Dam and wherever else. So we are seeing a changing nature of warfare, where the keyboard is becoming a much more important weapon of war. Wars don't have to be conducted from command centers forward located. They can be conducted or augmented from almost any garage or basement anywhere in the world. This is a real thing. This is, if you can't see it, this is a bomber dropping a USB thumb drive. One of the most serious attacks against the military computer systems was exactly this. It was a series of thumb drives provided by an adversary country for sale in the shops in Afghanistan, where US soldiers would go to purchase these thumb drives, and when they stuck them in their computer, it was malware in government-operated computers. The government had to go so far now as to actually, I mean, you can tell me if I'm still current, but at least 5-10 years ago, we were super gluing shut the USB ports on every government-issued laptop just to prevent a thumb drive with malware from being inserted in it. And this is our government accounting office showing that nearly all new Pentagon weapon systems are vulnerable to attack. That if you know better than me, please correct me, but last I heard, it was about 84% of our high-tech computer systems have software that originated outside the United States, and all of that is subject to some sort of questioning. Gangs becoming militias, intimidating local populations. Proxies, in this case, Lebanese Hezbollah, a proxy of Iran, operating as a political proxy in Lebanon, where they hold elected office, and operating as a military proxy in Syria, where they have been an important military element of Bashar al-Assad's attack on his own people. The flag of al-Qaeda. We don't think much about al-Qaeda anymore. Al-Qaeda's on the back burner, but it's not gone. And the leadership is still there. The aspirations are unchanged. When they reemerge as al-Qaeda V 3.0 probably, they will be more globally mobile with more foreign members and and dual passport holders, and they'll be more technologically adept. They were already technologically adept. And of course, this is Daesh or ISIS or ISIL or the Islamic State. Again, they've had much of their territory. I think they're fighting for their last sort of cubic yard, their last square yards of territory this week, but a lot of them have escaped and will resurface at some point in the future. So back to the world at night, maybe look at it a little bit different now in terms of these factors that are emerging around the world that affect how people and nations behave independently and with each other. One of the reasons that I like this graphic is because it doesn't show borders. Borders are less important in some ways than they used to be. It ain't your daddy's sovereignty. Competent militaries and border patrol forces can still defend territorial boundaries, but there's no such defense for cultural, for cross-border cultural activity, cross-border economic activity, cross-border informational activity. That is just a factor of a much more connected and mobile population on the planet. So if you take the world at night and you superimpose on it what I'll call Facebook world, this is a snapshot. It's not current. I couldn't find a real current one. This is actually about the time of the Arab Spring, but it was a moment in time showing Facebook connectivity. The brighter it is, the more connectivity there is. But you can take a lot away from this. But one of the things that I take away from it is that just because a place may be dark at night doesn't mean it's not connected. That in software, in social media terminology, anything can go viral. And by the way, it goes viral with a photograph or YouTube footage attached to it, annotated with whatever who posted it wants to put on it, no matter how untrue or true that may be. In the military terminology, it's every tactical action can have a strategic effect, and much more rapidly, forces much quicker decision-making in response now than before. And that if you take Facebook world on top of the world at night and you take the photographic negative of that, so that light is dark and dark is light, you can take a lot away from this. But one of the things I take away from it is just because a place is light at night doesn't mean it's well connected. And any assumptions we have about the people who are there, what they know, how they behave, how they might respond to some sort of external influence might be quite wrong. And don't get me wrong, I don't pretend that Facebook is the only social media platform, but many of the others are state-controlled. And Facebook does have a global, less controlled presence than most other social media. So you're not expected to read anything on this slide. But what you'll see is it's kind of Earth with stuff on it. When I was the Commander of Special Operations Command, so this goes back a few years, but I'm coming up against the clock here. My J5 strategic planner, a guy named Joe Miller, I just asked him to diagram how the Earth worked, sort of what I said, but over the last half hour, but put that in a diagram. I mean, what are the connectivities, the linkages, the relationships that actually affect how the world behaves? There's several hundred pages of research behind this, other country research, academic institution, think tank kind of research. But basically on this slide, if it's green or blue, it's a positive or a neutral connection. Think a treaty or some sort of an academic exchange or something like that. If it's red on here, it's a negative kind of connection. Think a criminal activity or an adversarial kind of relationship in some way. If it's an oval, it's a factor in that place. The United States, almost self-contradictory, is economics and homeland security. In South America, we have drugs, economic development, and a populism with anti-Americanism as part of that, and so on around the world. But what's important, what I want to call out are the red diamonds. There's only three things in the red diamonds, and they are migration, extremism, and crime. And where those two or more of those things tend to come together, they create a point of friction that ultimately has to be dealt with, either locally, regionally, or globally. And And I can spend hours staring at this slide because there's so much on this that I think is important to how we ought to be thinking about the world. But in the introduction, you learned that I teach at Columbia University in a graduate course there. When I started doing that a few years ago, I went back to Joe Miller at the United States Special Operations Command. Hey, Joe, remember that strategic appreciation thing you did for me a few years ago? I said, can I have that? I want to use it in my presentation to my students. Because, we've updated it. And I could spend, there's thousands of pages behind this. And I'm happy to provide it to anybody who wants it. It's the kind of thing with a magnifying glass you can stare at for weeks. Because this is not the bipolar world that many of us grew up in. It's a world of real complexity and several points of friction. And in the world that I grew up in, the special operations world, this is very important. That, I almost hate to say this in front of my frogman brothers, but the analogy here is that the United States is the frog in the pot, and the world friction is beginning to heat that pot. And as a military, we still tend to defend ourselves against the spear, when in fact we probably ought to be getting out of that pot and going around to help turn down the global heat. And that's one of the values that the United States Special Operations Command and the SEAL community bring to the world now. So you don't wish this away, but I think the probability of this is less than it was some years ago. The electronic fight, the electrons as bullets, the rise of increased competition now over the last couple of years against what are being called near-peer nations, near-peer adversaries in some cases, to include, and much of this is about cyber, but because we know that we're on the receiving end of cyber attacks from all of these. By the way, I love this. These uniforms. I don't know what wars the North Koreans have been in lately. Maybe these are all cyber badges, but yeah, that's just cool. I think it's much more about this. It's about war. It's about conflict, working with and against people who are so unlike us in many cases that we don't understand even what success or failure will mean to them. We don't know how to bring success to them because we're just not steeped in that. We still tend to be, in my view, a little bit too focused on the bright spots in the world at night. We do have some people who get at this. We have them riding horses in Afghanistan, talking to fast-moving aircraft to drop bombs, the marriage of no-tech and low-tech, SEALs who always had one foot in the water, operating hundreds of miles from the nearest water in the Hindu Kush of Afghanistan, still getting in at night with capabilities nobody expects you to have or underwater. Technology, unmanned aircraft with ability to penetrate jungle canopies, new and emerging technologies that are intended to help us. Yeah, so we didn't know, dogs have become a very important part of our special operations community and the broader military community. We didn't know that dogs needed to wear oxygen masks above 15,000 feet, but we know that a human does. So you strap a human oxygen mask on the dog when you parachute with him. And we didn't lose any dogs in parachute accidents. We lost a lot of dogs in combat, which, by the way, they're treated as a full member of the team when they die in combat. Jointness, Army helicopter, Navy boats, think of it at night in rough seas. Partners, most conflict now is addressed by coalition teams, still continuing to train and help those whom we wish success because it's better if they can find success in their way with their capability than for us to try to find it for them. At the high end, this is the Iraqi Special Operations Forces, and if I had been asked to convene a meeting of the best special operations forces in the world 10 years ago, the Iraqis would have been at the head table. They became very, very good over the last couple of decades. Always wanted to reach out to the next generation because, frankly, sometimes the current generation is impossible to work with. But you always want to provide that hope, that aspiration for those who are going to continue to live in that neighborhood after we leave. the development of sort of the cyber warriors and again, back to cyber. I'm not saying that the soldier on the left is going to transition to the warrior on the right, but we are finally beginning to accept that sometimes the most important qualification for a warrior is not how many push-ups you can do, that there are skills that others can bring into a military environment that are enormously valuable. And of course, reaching out to the population that we simply weren't able to reach out to before. We created within the Special Operations community while I was there what we called cultural support teams, for lack of a better term. But these were women who volunteered, were selected, assessed, trained, prepared to go forward, as far forward and stay as long as the tactical elements to which they were attached, the Ranger platoons, the SEAL platoons, the Green Beret A-teams, and the like, because we realized that there was at least half the population that our male soldiers couldn't talk to, couldn't learn anything from, and these were tremendously successful. They were, without exception, courageous, and in some cases heroic. 2 died in the line of duty. So this is all the yin and the yang of warfare for me. And I'm not a Taoist, but I do get that things that seem to be opposed at front may not be. They may actually be part of the same whole. And if you look at the traditional kinetic capture, kill, seize, destroy form of military warfare on the left, that's what we've focused our military on for many, many years. The mission of the military is to fight and win the nation's wars against other nation states. But now it's more than that. In this more complex global environment, there's a lot for the less kinetic side. And in the cliche, I'll say it's sort of platforms on the left and people on the right. It's training on the left and education on the right. It's mass on the left and finesse on the right. It's manning the equipment on the left and equipping the man or the woman on the right. And in my view, and one of the reasons I like to talk about this, in my view, we don't have it right. Right now, our defense budget, which was released yesterday, has about 94% on the left and about 6% on the right, and probably not changing anytime soon. And like the rest of the yin-yang, just because you're the kinetic force doesn't mean you don't need to understand where you are, and just because you're the force working with people and solving in a sort of less kinetic way doesn't mean you don't need to be able to fight and win in the places where we send you. So these are 4 things I wrote down as I was leaving command. I won't read them to you, but I wrote them down as military lessons, and the longer I'm in the private sector, the more I realize that they tend to be kind of universal, at least in my view. Yep, thank you very much. So it looks like they're going to thank me. But before they do that, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being here. You wouldn't be here if you weren't aware, engaged, in some cases concerned, maybe a little bit unsettled, in some cases cheerleading, and in some cases cheering against what's happening in various parts of the world. If you're one of the students, I think you live in a most fascinating time. I cannot imagine, what it's going to be like when you're, 30 or 40 years from now, what the world's going to look like. But for all of you who have some influence, who've taken the time out of your day to be here, I just want to thank you on behalf of, well, I guess just me. But I also want to say that as a guy, as many in this room have, who've sent people forward to do things that this nation has asked them to do. Some of them really hard, some of them really dangerous, and not always successful, and not everybody came back. It is really important for you in the ways that you can to build the strong communities, to contribute to the law enforcement, to build the sports programs and the entertainment and the safe neighborhoods and all of that. Because San Diego is a military-rich environment. And everybody who leaves here, most of the people who leave here, leave some element of their family behind. And it is really, really important to them to know that their family's in good hands when they're gone. So thank you much for doing that. Yep.
And in fact, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Lance Snell. I'm the Thomas and Evelyn Page Dean of Business, and we are just so thrilled to be a partner in this. And before I turn the floor back over to President De La Torre and Chin Ye, I want to dovetail on what the Admiral said. We have a lot of active service veterans and the families who support them in the audience today, and I'd like to ask them to stand and be recognized and be thanked for all that you do. Thanks for having our six, guys. President?
I want to take a moment to thank Admiral Olson and his wife. Admiral, you did an outstanding presentation, and I think we've learned a tremendous from this. On behalf of the university, we'd like to present this medallion to you, and thank you again.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you so much. If I ever put this on, I'm going to look like one of those North Korean generals. It's a cyber. Thank you so much.
Okay, on behalf of the university, I want to thank you again, and our presentation is over and our reception follows. Thank you so much.